and more people are dying than ever before, literally day after day. Now, we all hope and pray that the new vaccine will be distributed as quickly as possible and that it will put an end to this nightmare. But today, the truth is that millions of low-income and middle-class families are suffering in a way that they have not suffered since the Great Depression of the 30s. Today, the reality is that over half of our workers are living paycheck to paycheck, trying to survive on a starvation wage of 10 or 12 bucks an hour. The reality is that millions of our senior citizens are trapped in their homes, unable to see their kids or their grandchildren, unable to go to a grocery store, and many of them are trying to get by on $12,000, $14,000 a year Social Security and scared that they may come down with the virus and die. In addition, millions more with disabilities are suffering. Further, in our country today, 1 out of 4 workers are either unemployed or make less than $20,000 a year. And in the midst of this pandemic, because we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, in the midst of this pandemic, worst health care crisis in 100 years, over 90 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured and unable to go to a doctor when they need to. Further, we have the worst eviction crisis in modern history. Some 30 million families worried that because they cannot pay their rent, they may end up out on the street. That is, Mr. President, where we are today economically. And if this country means anything, if democracy means anything, if the U.S. government means anything, it means that we cannot turn our backs on this suffering. Not in Vermont, not in Wisconsin, not in New York, not in any state in this country where people are hurting in an unprecedented way. It means that we cannot leave Washington as senators for the holidays to go back to our families unless we address the pain and anxiety of other families throughout this country.
Would my colleague from Vermont yield for some support for his amendment?
I would be happy to yield to the
I'll speak briefly, and I thank my colleague. I want to join my friend Senator Sanders to support his amendment to give $1,200 in direct financial support to the American people in the year-end emergency relief bill. Now, this effort should not subtract from any other program already in the bill, like enhanced unemployment aid to small business, education, health care, or another provision. We don't need to offset the cost or cut from elsewhere in the bill to make sure the stimulus checks are $1,200 for each adult and then money for children and others, as he will elaborate. Much of the money will go back into the economy anyway. The reason for the amendment is simple. Over the course of this pandemic, working Americans have taken it on the chin. Millions have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. 26 million have had trouble putting food on the table in the last 5 weeks. Bread lines stretching down American highways. 12 million Americans owe an average of $6,000 in rent and mortgage. So we have an opportunity in this emergency relief bill to give financial aid directly to those Americans. It could mean the difference between Americans paying the rent or not, affording groceries or not, the difference between hanging on until the vaccine helps our country get back to normal. Now, the only objection we've heard is this will add too much to the deficit. That's why a Republican senator rejected a similar request earlier today to push a baseless agenda of austerity. Please, by now, Republican objections over debt and deficit are comical. They added $2 trillion to the debt for a massive tax cut for corporations and the wealthy, and that was during a steady economy. But now the economy is on life support. Americans are queuing up on bread lines, filing for unemployment just as a Democratic president is about to take office, all of a sudden the deficit scolds are back. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. Chairman Powell, hardly a big liberal, of the Federal Reserve, insisted the risk of overdoing it is less than the risk of underdoing it. The quickest way to get money into the pockets of the American people is to send some of their tax dollars right back where they came from. So let's step up to the plate, deliver the $1,200 survival checks to millions of Americans before the holidays. I support Senator Sanders' request fully and hope the Senate will consent and yield back.
Well, let me thank the senior senator from New York, the Democratic leader, for his strong statement. He is exactly right. In this time of crisis, it is comical that suddenly our Republican friends once again discover that we have a deficit. This is a moment of emergency, and we have got to respond to the needs of working families, and I thank Senator Schumer for his strong support for this legislation. Mr. President, members of Congress should also be aware that we are far behind other major countries in terms of protecting working families during this pandemic. Not only does every other wealthy country guarantee health care to all people as a human right, almost all of them are providing far more generous benefits to the unemployed and the struggling in their countries than we are doing in our country. Madam President, several months ago, I introduced legislation along with Senator Kamala Harris, now our Vice President-elect, and Senator Markey, that would, during the course of this economic crisis, provide $2,000 a month, $2,000 a month to every working-class person in this country. And frankly, that is exactly what we should be doing. But unfortunately, given the conservative nature of the Senate, I understand that is not going to happen. Yet, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, as Senator Schumer just indicated, at a time when huge corporations were making record-breaking profits, the Republican leadership here in the Senate was able to provide over $1 trillion in tax breaks to the 1% and large corporations. Yes, at a time when climate change, yes, climate change is real, at a time when climate change threatens the entire planet, this Congress was able to provide hundreds of billions of dollars in corporate welfare to the oil companies and the gas companies and the coal companies who are exacerbating the climate crisis. Yes, just the other day, here in the Senate and in the House, legislation was passed which would provide $740 billion to the military, the largest military budget in history, more than the next 10 nations combined. We spend more on the military than the next 10 nations combined. So we could do all of those things. Tax breaks for billionaires, massive corporate welfare, huge military expenditures. But in the midst of the worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression, somehow Congress is unable to respond effectively to the needs of working families. Madam President, as you may know, I have recently introduced legislation to provide every working-class American an emergency payment of at least $1,200, which is $2,400 for a couple and $500 for each of their children. This is not a radical idea. This is an idea that is supported by President Donald Trump. It is an idea that is supported by President-elect Joe Biden. It is an idea, by the way, that according to a recent poll is supported by 75% of all Americans, including 77% of Democrats and 72% of Republicans. Further importantly, this amount of direct payment is exactly what Congress passed unanimously 9 months ago as part of the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. Let me repeat. In March, every member of the House and Senate, appropriately, including myself, voted to provide a direct payment of $1,200 for working-class adults, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for their kids. Madam President, that was the right thing to do 9 months ago. And given the fact that the crisis today is in many respects worse than it was 9 months ago, that is exactly what we should be doing right now. Madam President, as a result of the pandemic, the government told restaurants and bars, retail stores, movie theaters, schools, malls, small businesses all over this country, shut your doors. It is too dangerous for you to be open now. And they did that because that is what the public health experts said was the right thing to do in order to control this horrific pandemic. But what the government has not done, Madam President, is to provide the workers who lost their jobs and lost their incomes as a result of those shutdowns with the help that they need in order to pay their bills and to survive economically. The $600 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits that Congress passed unanimously in March expired in July, over 5 months ago. And during that time, the Republican Senate has done nothing to help working families pay their rent, feed their children, go to a doctor, or pay for the life-saving prescription drugs they need. And the Senate has not done anywhere near enough to provide help for the struggling small businesses in Vermont and all across this country who are desperately trying to stay afloat. Further, Madam President, as bad as the economy has been in general, it has been far worse for African Americans and Latinos. During the pandemic, nearly 60% of Latino families and 55% of African American families have either experienced a job loss or a cut in pay. Madam President, for 9 months, we have asked tens of millions of working people in this country to survive on one $1,200 check, with no help for health care, no support for hazard pay, no assistance for rent relief. Absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Madam President, I should mention that over this same 9-month period, 651 billionaires in the United States became over $1 trillion richer.
Did you do it?
No, I'm not a murderer.
Well, I'm the only one who can help you now.
$1 trillion in increased wealth for the very richest people in our country. One $1,200 check for tens of millions of Americans desperately trying to survive. That is unconscionable, that is immoral, and that has got to change. Now, Madam President, let us recall that way back in May, the House of Representatives passed the $3.4 trillion HEROES Act, which, among other things, included $600 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits and another direct payment of $1,200 for working-class adults, $500 for their kids, and generous support for small businesses, hospitals, education facilities, and state and local government. In other words, the House passed a $3.4 trillion bill that was, in fact, a very serious effort to address the enormous crises facing our country. I should also add that in July, several months later, the House passed another version of the bill, so-called HEROES 2. And this legislation was for $2.2 trillion. That same month, in July, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell proposed a $1.1 trillion bill that also provided $1,200 direct payment for working-class adults and $500 for their kids. And then in October, Secretary Mnuchin, in negotiations with Speaker Pelosi, proposed a COVID relief plan for $1.8 trillion. That's Mnuchin representing the Trump administration. So in the last number of months, we have had major proposals of $3.4 trillion, $2.2 trillion, $1.8 trillion, and from Majority Leader McConnell, $1.1 trillion. And yet today, right now, after months of negotiating by the so-called Gang of Eight, we are now down to just $908 billion in legislation, and that includes $560 billion in offsets in unused money from the CARES Act. So what we are talking about now is going from an original House bill passed in May calling for $3.4 trillion in new money down to today $348 billion in new money, roughly 10% of what Democrats thought was originally needed. Madam President, in my view, the $348 billion in new money that is included in the proposal now being discussed is totally inadequate given the nature of the unprecedented crises that we face. The American people cannot wait any longer. They need economic relief. Right now, their kids are going hungry. They are being evicted from their homes. They can't go to the doctor. They need help, and they need it now. Every working class American needs $1,200 at least, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for children. And let me be clear to emphasize a point that Senator Schumer made, and that is what I am talking about now is money that must not be taken from other important priorities like 16 weeks of supplemental unemployment benefits, aid for small business, nutrition, housing, education, and the other important provisions in this bill. We need adequate funding to address the unprecedented crises that we face. We should not and cannot and must not take from Peter to pay Paul. We cannot cut on unemployment benefits in order to help small business. We have got to do it all right now. So, Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-5063, which I introduced earlier today, that would provide a $1,200 direct payment to every working-class adult, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for their children, that the bill be considered read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
Senator from Wisconsin.
reserving the right to object. The senator from Vermont made a couple statements. I'd just like to repeat the words that we're in a crisis. This is an emergency. We can't turn our back on this suffering. I agree. I've agreed for months. But he also said something that was completely incorrect. You might call it a lie. He said Republicans have done nothing. That's not true. I was on daily calls during the August recess after we had attempted and were debating internally a $1 trillion package in tail end of July before the August recess. Recognizing, and I was one of the ones pointing out the fact that we'd already passed, as a good senator from Vermont said, over $3 trillion in 4 different COVID relief financial packages early in the pandemic. There was at that point in time, there was $1.2 trillion of that unspent. A big chunk of that wasn't even obligated. Today, as we stand here debating this now, we still have a little under $600 billion unspent and unobligated. So the point I was making to my Republican colleagues during that the last few weeks in July, in those conference calls in August, is before we authorize any more money, before we further mortgage our children's future, why don't we first repurpose and redirect what we already passed? Because what we passed very quickly. Because we had to. We had to do something massively, and we did something massively so that markets wouldn't seize, so that the people, the individuals that were out of work through no fault of their own, the businesses that were shut down through no fault of their own, could get financial relief. And so we came together unanimously, we did that. But doing it fast, doing it massively, I certainly knew it was going to be far from perfect. And when we found out the federal government actually has a hard time spending $3 trillion because over the course of a number of months, they didn't spend it all. They couldn't even obligate it. So what Republicans did during the August recess, because we couldn't come to an agreement by the end of July, we worked long and hard on a targeted bill. More than $600 billion, $300 plus up for people on unemployment, $260 billion for small businesses, $100 billion for education, tens of billions of dollars for vaccines and testing and agriculture and childcare. And we offered that on the floor. 52 Republicans voted to proceed to that bill. Democrats just said no. I felt it was a crisis, an emergency, and we shouldn't have been turning our backs on these people that are suffering in September. Democrats said no. All they had to do was say yes. They couldn't take yes for an answer.